My name is Neil Munro. I'm here with Dr. Tinashe and Mushakavanhu on the top of the St Cross building in the city centre in Oxford. And we're here to talk a bit about Dambudzo Marechera's time when he was studying at Oxford, and particularly how far his book, The Black Insider, which was published after he had died, we'll say a bit about that, reflects some of his experiences in working in the English faculty library or at the English faculty, which is where the English faculty is based, right here at the St Cross building. The St Cross building was here when Marechera was in Oxford in the early 1970s. It was designed and built between 1960 and 1964, and is kind of very imposing structure, as we may say something about as well. It's three really quite sort of giant cubes kind of stuck together, and it houses both the English faculty, the English faculty library, the law faculty, and the law faculty library. It has a lecture theatre right in the middle of it, and also has a rather nice little cafe which was sitting outside on one of the top floors. It was designed by Sir John Leslie Martin and Colin St John Wilson, with some additional work by Patrick Hodgkinson, and is in many respects probably very similar in terms of its structure to what Marechera would have encountered in the early 1970s. So maybe we can begin, Tinashe, by talking a little bit about the building and his kind of description of it. So in The Black Insider, he does have a moment where he describes something that might be based, and we can't say for sure, but might be based on the faculty itself. Would you mind reading us just that little bit?
The faculty itself is small when seen from outside, but inside it is stupendously labyrinthine, with its infinite ramifications of little nooks of rooms, some of which are bricked up to isolate forever the rotting corpses within. The plague has taken its toll of those like myself who have sought refuge under its dark wing. I'm on the top floor of the 4 stories.
Which is kind of roughly where we are at the moment.
Yes.
And later on we'll have another sort of look at the way in which he says the speaker of this book, or the narrator in this book, talks about sleeping on the top floor outside when homeless in Oxford. So what do you think of this building? How does this building kind of speak to what kind of Marechera is talking about in The Black Insider? Because it is this extraordinary book where there is a sort of war going on outside this building where they are. And they say that historically this building was the Faculty of Arts, as he calls it, and there are all these other people who are kind of ex-academics, maybe students, who he's talking to and having these really quite in-depth intellectual conversations with. What do you make of those kind of conversations? Why is it important for him to kind of situate a lot of those within this, what used to be a Faculty of Arts?
Interestingly, I mean, New College, where Marechera was a student, is pretty much a stone's throw away from where we are sitting. And it's fascinating to think that Marechera could have used the Faculty of Arts as the source of some of his trauma in Oxford, negotiating his place within the institution, his difficulties with the curriculum, with the tutorial system of Oxford. So there's something about using the structure of the Faculty of Arts or the Faculty of English as a source of trauma that he's sort of grappling with throughout this text.
And I guess he does talk about it as being labyrinthine in that description there, and that does, in some ways, if you look around us, it does seem it's very blocky. There are clearly places like dead ends. You could get lost here quite easily. In fact, I did actually get lost when I was coming up through the middle trying to find this cafe. So, and the entrance to it is quite a sort of imposing entrance as well, isn't it? It sort of looms up this building from the road.
Yeah, but the labyrinthine could also refer to the sort of bureaucratic ways in which Oxford life is regulated. Nothing is straightforward in Oxford. You have to negotiate offices, buildings, institutes within the same university set up. So there could also be kind of a frustration. So it could also be just a metaphor of just how difficult it is to negotiate Oxford as an experience, and particularly for somebody who was coming in from Rhodesia and kind of just like thrown into the deep end.
So should we have a quick look at that bit in where he talks about sleeping on top of the building.
I slept 3 nights on the roof of the English faculty library, dazed somewhat by the unusual first time without a roof, polish of the stars shining down on my sleeping bag. I was just about to start a journey of discovery in the real United Kingdom.
So I find that really fascinating, that idea that he is somehow, at that point, if he is, whether it's Marechera himself talking about his own experiences, maybe we can say a little bit about to what extent you think it is based on his own experiences or not, but him having somehow, if he's become homeless in Oxford, separated himself from that college, which, as you say, is just literally just down the street, from this building to an extent, and yet still attached to the building. He's still here, sleeping on the roof, and he's sort of simultaneously kind of separated from it, but also still a part of it. So do you think, is there a part of that narrator speaking those words who is wishing still to be part of the institution, or is he deliberately sort of using the building in a way that it's not supposed to be used, as a kind of, in a way, a sort of disruptive way, I suppose, a kind of illogical way?
To a lot of extent, Marechera is, I think, at least at the beginning, or in his younger years, is a creature of habit. He gravitates towards people he knows, communities he knows, and I think when the fissures with the college begin, and he is pretty much becoming homeless, he goes to the places he knows, and the Faculty of English, in a lot of ways, is one of those places. So there's a kind of comfort to sleep outside the library of all these like writers and people that he founds influence in, that he reads, that he connects himself to, and I think in a lot of ways it is fascinating that he needs the proximity to the library for sustenance. That is not something he necessarily talks about in the book, because what he does in the book is that he creates a community of outsiders, of malcontents, people who have just been discarded out of society. So in a sense, he kind of almost animates the library by turning books into characters that he's interacting with. So there's something very fascinating about the situating of the book. And is it real life? I think to some extent it is. We are now talking about autofiction. This is autofiction at its best. There are elements of Marechera that come in and out of the text. So I think we've discussed about Marechera before, where he talks about where he pauses in the narrative and promises to come back to the story. So there's a way in which he's in and out of the narrative is presenting to us. So this kind of, I think the situating at the Faculty of Arts is more than symbolical. It's a sustenance, it's a form of imaginative sustenance that sort of plays out through the characters that are introduced in the book.
And you've talked before about the idea in which, to the extent to which Marechera is going to create an alternative curriculum for himself. He's still here. If he is sleeping on the building or on top of the building, and he is finding an alternative way of pursuing his education. And it's extraordinary the number of times he mentions writers in here who he clearly has a love for. The number of writers he mentions, just to give a very brief list of the first few pages, he starts really intriguingly with reading Stella Gibbons's Cold Comfort Farm. He mentions Voltaire, he mentions George Bernard Shaw, he mentions classical Greek tragedies, James Joyce, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Ivan Turgenev, Carl Jung, R.D. Lang, Herbert Marcuse, William Shakespeare, Truman Capote, William S. Burroughs. You could go on and on. They're largely male writers, aren't they? Which is, I suppose, consistent with his influences generally. Very few women, apart from Gibbons, maybe a couple of others. Very few African writers. Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Peter Abrahams he mentions, but very few. Who are his influences, do you think, around? I know it's hard to say exactly who they are, but generally, who do you think his strong literary influences are?
His influences are eclectic. and also very in a very interesting way, very contemporaneous. So these are people are talking about at that particular time in the 70s. So he's very much in tune with the aesthetic debates about literature, psychology, psychoanalysis. He is interested in all the sort of, contentious issues around literary production, around literary scholarship during this period. And I mean, one of the most fascinating comments that comes from pretty much a supporter and probably one of Marechera's favorite readers was John Wiley. So John Wiley read a lot of these manuscripts that Marechera was producing at this time. And he argues that the Black Insider reads like a clever dissertation for a PhD. So there's a lot of Marechera that is engaging with scholarship, with criticism, with the cultural discourse of the times, and it's also very regional. I mean, writers come in and out. I think Russian, Soviet Union writers influence Marechera. Marechera's thinking about genre, about I guess dealing with politics in fiction. But he's also attracted to the beat writers, kind of their use of drugs, their sort of itinerant existence, their sense of homelessness sort of creeps into his work. So there's a way in which influences activate different parts of Marechera. I think in a lot of ways they activate the versions of himself that he wants to be, or that he wants to test out to an audience. He performs himself in that way, and performs himself in a way that is a form of reading, active reading of literature and life.
It's really interesting you mentioned those. One of the things that certainly stands out a lot in this book is this kind of sense of the exile, how the exile, and maybe we'll say a little bit about that in a second when we talk about what the Black Insider might be, because there are clearly, there's a section which references that quite extensively. But it is really interesting that he is talking about this kind of alternative curriculum, but also this kind of alternative way of living in the world, and some of that is very much influenced by literature. And he talks about, with one of the other characters, the protagonist talks with another character in the book where he talks about it's almost as if we are having a tutorial at this moment, but a better tutorial than we might have if we were actually in the college. So it is again as if he's kind of creating these kind of alternative spaces to do the kinds of things he could have done if he were still at the university. Could you just talk a little bit about what essentially happens in the Black Insider? What kind of text is it? What's happening in the background? Why do you think he writes it?
The Black Insider is essentially Marechera's second book. This is the book he writes after the critically acclaimed The House of Hunger. And there was desperation from his publishers for him to develop, a novel, and what happens is that in a period of 6 months, he produces 5 manuscripts. So there's a refusal in him to conform to genre or to the expectations of the publisher. So he starts using these drafts as a way of fighting the publishing system and insisting on his own version of reality or on his idea of literature. And so that sort of plays out in the writing of this work. And so the Black Insider is a book set at this fabled Faculty of Arts, involves a constellation of characters who are all either literary types, creatives, playwrights, just a different mix, an interesting mix of people that are interacting together, I don't necessarily feel they're feeling sorry about themselves, but I think they're trying to make sense of the world outside. So they are inside, making sense of the irrational ways the world reads them, interprets them, And it's again, I think this is also the first, well, maybe not the first time, but it is also in the same Marechera way. It combines poetry, autobiographical, fictional. So it's also a combination of different forms.
As well as a kind of drama.
Yes, there's a drama except that is modeled around Julius Caesar. So it's kind of a localized version of Julius Caesar
about
Zimbabwean politics in the 70s. Yeah. There is a bigger. So this is an abridged, fascinating. Importantly, this is an abridged version of this book. There's a much bigger manuscript that was originally submitted to Heinemann. It's in the Heinemann archives. So the posthumous version publication is a much shorter version of the original manuscript.
So it's edited down.
It is edited down.
Who does the editing of that?
It's the literary executor or the editor, Marechera's long-term editor, Flora Wittwald.
And then in the background, he's also got this wall going on outside the building, which is gradually falling apart and eventually ends in this kind of destruction at the very, not to give too much away, but that's kind of what happens towards the end. There's this kind of apocalyptic kind of moment, and there's a constant sense of kind of threat and paratroopers landing and soldiers outside, and this sense that gradually things are just eroding. Why do you think that is important to him, to have this kind of war context or this conflict, I suppose, going on outside?
I mean, there are many ways of reading, these references to war, but part of the background of Marechera's existence in Oxford is that there's an actual war happening in Rhodesia in the late 70s. And there was a part of him and his generation that was feeling guilty for absconding from the war in pursuit of education. So he's feeling a little bit lost. But at the same time, apartheid South Africa is also in the imagination of the world, as a war zone, as a conflicted zone, and this is also at the tail end, of the Cold War. So there are also kind of unrelated events that speak to war that I think are encoded in this narrative, and also I think it's also metaphors and imageries informed by Marechera's own reading at the time, and I'm not sure what that reading is, whether it's fiction, it's newspaper reportage, but it's a combination of influences from real life, from real war situations around the world.
Yeah, the reference, there are so many references in this text, it's hard to pin down exactly what he might have been reading at any particular moment. Could you read a little bit there about the war reference?
The fighting had been going on for a long time. In fact, no one, I mean myself, could remember when the thing had begun, how it had begun, why it had ever begun at all, and finally who was supposed to be on whose side. All I know is that at one stage it was us blacks against the whites, but somehow or other things had suddenly become complicated, and it was no longer a black against white chess game. It was more like a kaleidoscope in which every little chink of color in the shaken picture was fighting every other little chink. News agencies could not keep track of the alliances and the counter-alliances, the neutrals and the non-aligned, the ferocious and the hyper-feral. Meanwhile, the cities were rotting, becoming mass graves in which there were tiny pockets of plague outbreaks.
It's really extraordinary. It's so dystopian, I suppose, isn't it? And apocalyptic. It's not just the war. There's also this plague, which is going on, and this kind of sense of kind of the whole country falling apart. And yet, at other points, he makes it much more kind of international, doesn't he? He sort of references other parts around the world. It might be sort of Africa, but he might also be talking about historical events. The Holocaust is mentioned at one point. He mentions Uganda as well. So there's lots of different kind of countries, European countries as well. America. They all seem to be. His worldview seems to be much more about the world, not just about Oxford, not just about Rhodesia becoming Zimbabwe. It's not just that. It's not limited to that.
I think the House of Hunger and Mind Blast are two texts that are directly specific to the Zimbabwean experience. But then with the Black Insider and Black Sunlight, there's a way in which Marechera uses the world as a canvas of his imagination and sort of pulls in references and allusions from different parts of the world. I mean, I think the most beautiful thing about that is he is able to weave these very much disparate sources together and make them work and produce a poetical and coherent narrative. Everything works together. I think that's also the interesting thing about works by Marechera. How do you edit this work? Because I think that's also an argument that plays out in the archives when you try to follow the textual histories of these books. How do you edit Marechera? What do you remove? What do you add? And that creates a complexity, because in a lot of ways he presents you the work as it should exist and circulate. So it's very much difficult to remove things, because once you remove references to writers, to events, to moments, it doesn't make sense.
He has a very uncompromising vision, doesn't he? Both in this book, but also of, as you were saying earlier, of his own textual reality and what his understanding of literature is, as opposed to what his publisher's understanding of literature is, and so there is a kind of ongoing conflict, I suppose, with his estate.
I mean, he does talk a lot about it. He kind of almost parodies it. When he talks about publishing as a parasitic, system. So he's very much aware of what he's participating in, and somehow he finds a way of bringing it into the actual narrative. And I think these are also the moments, the points in which Marechera and his imagination meet. I think there are things where we know that it is him, but then there are also moments we know that he's moved out of the narrative. He talks about the narrator of this book being a 27-year-old who publishes his first novel. That was exactly the age Marechera was when his first book was published. So there are hints of himself inside the book, and also move out. And it is a manifesto in a lot of ways about Marechera's own ideas of publishing, of his vision of a writer, of a creative writer, of a black writer, or a writer of the world, and there are direct responses to the publishers. So the conversation, the expectation of what type of book, he critiques all of that in this text.
And that, just because you're thinking about it there, and also in that quotation, there is that sense of what is the struggle, and whether that is him thinking about kind of a liberation struggle, not just necessarily about Zimbabwe, but a kind of more, how does he become liberated from a certain way of being understood, and how does he get liberated from an institution, how does he liberate his imagination. That also seemed to kind of key in, at least at that point, two issues around race, and whether that war is between blacks and whites, or whether it's a kind of more kaleidoscopic, as he rather, again, poetically puts it. And there's an interesting moment where he talks about one of his friends, or at least his kind of interlocutors, and as he calls him a friend, who he met in Oxford, who himself was a Zimbabwean writer and published very successfully some novels. And I wonder if you could just read that bit, because that's an interesting kind of insight into those kind of relationships he has.
There was only one other black person apart from myself, Stanley, with whom I'd read English literature. We had read each other's poems and short stories and criticized each other's efforts with that sincere insincerity of two people who know each other, only deep enough to wound. There were lots of black people in the university, but I'd lost the capacity to recognize them in myself when their smiles for me became arid and harsh as soon as the news got about that I had been sent down in disgrace. It seemed I could not meet any one of them, including Stanley, without being given a lecture on the "I told you so, got what you deserve" theme.
So who is this? Because this is, as I say, an actual writer, isn't it? And it also can be some of that discussion about the students maybe relates to his scholarship as well.
So the Stanley mentioned is a writer called Stanley Nyamfukuza. So he's a contemporary of Marechera. They arrived in Oxford at the same time. Marechera was a student at New College, and Stanley was a student at Lincoln College. And they had both been expelled from the University of Rhodesia. So they had a friendship that sustained during that period of exile, but also when both of them moved back to Zimbabwe, they reconnected, and Stanley eventually published Marechera's last book when he was alive, Mind Blast. I met with Stanley Nyamfukuza, when I was doing my doctorate years ago, and I wanted to learn more about Oxford from his own perspective. And I mean, he found it fascinating that us as scholars and readers and fans of Marechera have our own conception of him. And he said to me, the Marechera you all write about and talk about is not the Marechera I remember. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, Marechera was part of a community of people. He was not isolated. He was one of us. He attended events, whether we are having social drinks, we are having meals together, we fought and argued like, any community of people fight and argue in any place. And I found that very fascinating, because the prevailing reading of Marechera that exists is of him as very much isolated. I mean, he does get homeless and all of that, but even in those moments of homelessness, these friends are still taking care of him. They're still feeding him. They are taking turns to give him a place to sleep and all of that. And kind of that kind of humane Marechera has been lost in kind of our own speculative readings of him.
And yet there are still moments in this text, actually, where he mentions specific people who he was living with, who he stayed with, or he celebrated with when he got the book contract. So, yeah, whether it's the real Marechera or not, there's definitely that kind of sense of community. And even, I suppose, within this faculty that he's created, or the building, there is this, as you were saying earlier, this kind of community of kind of intellectuals or artists.
Yeah. Or community is important to Marechera. It's, whether it's an imagined community. So all that long line of influences, of references, he builds. If he can't find a community, he will imagine it, and up to the end of his life, there's always an attempt to create, build, sustain a sense of community around his writing projects. His writing could not have happened without that yearning for community, or an attempt to be part of a community.
So one of the people he does talk to in this book, or at least the protagonist talks to in this book, is a man in a dressing gown, and I'm not sure he's actually given a name, but it's somebody who is again a kind of interlocutor, or kind of somebody who provokes him into thought. And he does give huge amounts of space over to this guy, actually, and other people as well. So there's little of the kind of Marechera voice at that point. And yet, I suppose some of the things he may well share with some of the perspectives of that character, or some of the other characters. And this is also the character who talks about the kind of the black insider as an idea. I wonder if you could maybe just read a little bit of that and talk about what that idea means as a concept.
Do you write poetry? I asked him. He looked at me oddly. I used to. Now I just talk. What did you mean by insider? His fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of the chair. He muttered, does it matter? Inside out is outside in. But there's always bleeding and hidden persuaders. Do you know how to make a man who walks away from his shadow? The most important thing about the Black Insider for me is if there is a genealogy of Black Lives Matter, the Black Insider has to be part of the reading list. It is a foreshadowing of all of the things that a new generation is suddenly discovering, but it's always been present, and I think that's kind of maybe, if there is power to the Black Insider, it's power is in the ways that it has resonated with the current struggles, racial struggles in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in different parts of the world. People sometimes talk about Marechera as a prophet, or the propheticality of his writings. I think this book, like the ways that The House of Hunger has been read as a foreshadowing of all the political crisis that happened in Zimbabwe, this book is also a foreshadowing of the things that have gone on in the world. And it's in a sense, it's absurd to think that this is a 20th century book that speaks to now in the 21st century.
Yes, and that idea there, where he's talking about the kind of the insider and the ability to walk away from your own shadow. At one point, then the protagonist then says, "Self-effacement is not. I have not yet mastered." It is interesting thinking about Marechera as clearly as somebody who has not been effaced at all, actually. Despite the relatively small amount of his kind of publications, posthumously books like this have appeared, so he is very much kind of visible in that sense, and yet maybe not so much kind of in Oxford. He's not necessarily one of the writers you necessarily think about when you think about kind of Oxford and the literary scene. But as you say, he still has this extraordinary kind of contemporary resonance with a lot of those kind of topics around kind of race, both in the States or here. So he is very much kind of, I suppose, a writer of the 21st century as well as a writer of kind of 20th century as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way he's a writer of transition, and that is true to the times he was writing, but that is also true to now in the ways that is being read and being appropriated in cultural struggles in this country, in Zimbabwe, across the African continent.